Let's go live to the Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers, who joins me from Brisbane. Mr Chalmers, thanks very much for your time. This result could well benefit Australia. How soon would you like to see a free trade deal done with the UK?
Good morning, Kieran. First of all, to congratulate Prime Minister Johnson on what was, in the end, a pretty resounding victory. Clearly, as Brexit occurs now, Australia's relationship with the UK will change, and trade's a very important part of that relationship. In the Labor Party, we intend to engage constructively. As always, we want to make sure that any new trade deal is good for Australia and good for Australian workers. But really, the sooner the better that we can get that new relationship with the UK post-Brexit sorted, the better.
So in terms of the lessons for progressive parties out of the Corbyn experiment, what can the ALP learn from that debacle?
Well, I think we had our own lessons to learn from the election that we had in May, and we went through a review process to do that. We're not obsessed now about what happened in May 2019. We're looking forward. But certainly there are lessons for all parties of the centre-left all around the world. There were two parts to that election result in the UK. The first part was obviously Brexit. One party was promising to end the drama around Brexit. The other one was promising in one way or another to prolong it. That was part of the result, but it wasn't all of the result. I think the lesson for centre-left parties is that you don't beat populism of the right with populism of the left. I've been saying that for some time now. You can't win an election just by preaching to your base. You need to build much bigger constituencies of support, and that begins with a bedrock of economic credibility.
And in terms of rebuilding that support, does it reinforce the views that you've expressed in recent months about trying to re-engage with the working class base that left the Labor Party in droves at the recent election?
Absolutely, Kieran. I mean, it's self-evident that we didn't build a big enough constituency for change in our own election, and our counterparts in the UK similarly. And so we need to think long and hard about how we do that. We need to make sure that we can build a big constituency for change. In my view, that begins with ensuring that we have a bedrock of economic credibility, that we are communicating to people, that we be a safe pair of hands on the economy, that we realise that more people need to get ahead and not just get by in this economy, and that's what we're doing. And under Anthony Albanese, I think we have learned the lessons from May. We did that review, and now we're looking forward. And I think Australians deserve a really good opposition, a Labor opposition in Australia, because we've got a government under Scott Morrison which is failing on the economy, failing on climate change, and which has failed to bring the country together after what was a pretty divisive election in May.
Was Anthony Albanese's tour of regional Queensland last week, where he's supporting jobs and coal exports, he's copped flack for doing that during the fires and during this climate debate, but is that fair criticism, or was it crucial in order to do some of the things you're talking about, re-engaging with those who, incidentally do vote for Labor at the state level, just drop you when it comes to federal elections?
I don't think it was a fair criticism, Kieran. It's always a good time to visit Queensland, and Anthony is always welcome here. It's not like he just discovered the joint. He's been in other roles, principally in infrastructure and local government. He's been a regular visitor to regional Queensland and to Brisbane. And he's always had Queensland front and centre in his thinking, and that's the same now that he's the leader. I think what Anthony recognises and what we recognise in the Labor Party is that you can take genuine action on climate change, you can create new jobs in renewable energy without abandoning our traditional strengths. I think this debate has become unnecessarily polarised, and that Scott Morrison has fed that, because he's always looking for an excuse not to do anything on climate change. He's always looking for a distraction from the fact that we've got emissions rising. He's always looking for a political wedge and a scare campaign, but that doesn't reflect where the Australian people are at. And what the Australian people want is they want us to listen respectfully to the experts and to the science. They want genuine action taken on climate change in a way that is respectful of people's lives and livelihoods in places like regional Queensland. And that's the approach that Anthony's taking and that we're taking. and I think that closely accords with what the Australian people want and expect from Canberra.
Are you comfortable with where the emissions targets are at for Labor, i.e. 45% reductions? Is that something that you can reconcile with your message to, the traditional resources and coal communities?
Well, I'm obviously not going to announce the targets we take to the next election here, still a couple of years from that election. We'll take our time, we'll be consultative as always, and we'll come up with a climate change plan which is more ambitious than the government, which takes genuine action, which is mindful of people's lives and livelihoods, which recognises that we can create new jobs in renewable energy without abandoning our traditional strengths.
In relation to that, though, do you feel, is the message able to be reconciled between that, what you say in regional Queensland, and, say, suburban and urban Melbourne and Sydney?
I think it can, Kieran. I think millions and millions of Australians just want a sensible, responsible action taken on climate change, meaningful action. They want us to recognise that new jobs can be created without abandoning our traditional strengths. I think that accords with the views of people in Queensland and in Victoria, right around Australia. And I think it has become unnecessarily polarised, partly because of things like that convoy, which was counterproductive, but also because Scott Morrison wants the debate polarised. I think Anthony Albanese is doing a good job communicating to the Australian people that we can take real action in a way that is mindful and respectful of the way that people make a living in central Queensland.
Do you empathise with the argument of Joel Fitzgibbon, who has said that Labor should adopt basically a bipartisan target with the government, reduce your ambition to 26 to 28% by 2030?
Well, the person with principal responsibility for the development of our policy here is Mark Butler, in conjunction with the whole shadow cabinet, and Joel has an opportunity, of course, to feed into that deliberation, as we all do. And I respect everybody's views in this policy area. It's a difficult policy area. My personal view is that we can take a more ambitious approach to the election than the government. I think the government has been basically twiddling their fingers while Australia has burned, literally. And I think we need to have a proper conversation about what can be done here, and that whatever the Morrison government is doing is insufficient to deal with the real challenge we have of climate change in this country.
Bill Shorten backed the Adani project, then during the Batman by-election said he was against it, and then equivocated during the election campaign. Was it important for Anthony Albanese in this last week to state explicitly that it's got its approval, it should get on with it now?
Well, I think Anthony's comments reflect the reality. The mine has been approved. There is substantial work already going on, substantial equipment being assembled on the site. Whether people support or oppose that mine, it's going ahead. It won't be as big a feature of the next election as it was at the last one. And so I think Anthony's comments just reflect that reality.
And are you happy with those jobs created? Because the Galilee Basin has quite a bit of potential in terms of resources, jobs, doesn't it, if more mines are approved in that region?
Well, clearly those communities rely very heavily on mining jobs, and we need to be respectful and mindful of that, as I've said a couple of times already today. I think we can take meaningful action on climate change without abandoning those communities, and that'll be our approach.
We'll get to the mid-year budget update. It's coming tomorrow. I will ask you about that in a moment. But just to pick up further on this certainty out of Brexit, we've seen the pound sterling surge a couple of percentage points. Obviously, the investors were relieved at a bit of clarity on that front. And then now the first phase of a China-US trade deal. Are things starting to ease, in the international community? The Treasurer talks about headwinds. Are they softening?
Oh, look, first of all, Kieran, I mean, what's been happening between the US and China is not the major cause of our weakness in our own economy here at home, but it hasn't helped. And I think, like all of the economies and all the countries around the world, we want to see the Americans and the Chinese get on the same page and resolve their differences. So any progress along the lines of what we've seen in the last couple of days is welcome. But we shouldn't get carried away by it. There's still a long way to go. It's just the first phase of the negotiations. And if the global economy is to grow more strongly, we need the two big beasts in our region to come to some kind of accommodation. So we hope that that happens. There's been a step taken towards that, but it's not on its own sufficient to put everything on the right and proper footing.
On to the forecast tomorrow with the wages. Shane Wright in the Nine papers today reports that they will be downgraded again, wages growth. You know, obviously it's a symptom of our sluggish economy, but is it not a symptom of most developed economies right now?
Well, the government's got their wages forecast wrong 33 times over various budget and budget updates. And what that shows is that ordinary Australian workers are paying the price for the Morrison government's incompetence, ineptitude and inaction on the economy. The mid-year budget update tomorrow will be a humiliating admission from the government that growth is slower, wages are weaker, and that most of the debt in the budget at the moment is actually Liberal debt because they've more than doubled it. So it will be a signed confession that after promising at the election that they'd make the economy even stronger, the Morrison government has actually made the economy even weaker. It's deteriorated on their watch. And you ask me about other countries around the world. It's important to remember that when the IMF downgraded growth, just like the OECD did and the Reserve Bank did, when they downgraded our growth numbers for Australia, they downgraded us by 4 times, a multiple of 4 times more than the other advanced economies. And what that shows is that even with some concerns in the global economy, the issues in our economy at home are principally homegrown, and they are principally a function of a government which doesn't have a plan to turn things around.
Well, if you look at one key barometer, and that's unemployment, that's one area where it's improved since they took office. It was 5.7% when they won, it's now 5.3%. Given the economic conditions around the world, isn't that at least one success they can point to?
Well, in the most recent unemployment numbers, the unemployment rate actually rose. I think something like 19,000 jobs were shed in the last month alone. So it's not a good story for them to tell on employment. Wages growth slowed again in the most recent numbers. But if you want to talk about the change between when Labor was in office and now, consider this. Growth now, annual growth, is slower than what it was at the election, slower than what it was when Morrison and Frydenberg took over, and slower than what it was when Labor was in office. And I think what that shows is it's not enough for this Liberal Party to wander around Australia pretending they're good at managing the economy when the facts tell a very different story, whether it's the facts about growth, wages, productivity, household debt, public debt, which has more than doubled. Right across the board, this government finishes the year with a big F for fail on the economy.
With the tax cuts, though, doesn't all the evidence suggest that people are pocketing and paying down their debt with those tax cuts? Isn't that a good thing to see personal debt? You referred to the household debt. Well, quite clearly, that would have reduced in recent times given the tax cuts.
Well, household debt's actually at record highs. It's almost double income, so that's one fact, as well as public debt more than doubling. But household debt's extraordinarily high. It's never been higher than it is right now.
So isn't it good that people are using the tax cuts to reduce that?
Oh, well, people will make their own decisions about how they use their tax cuts. I think most of us were hoping that more of it would find its way into the economy. Consumption is most of the Australian economy, and it's at very low levels at the moment. It barely grew in the last national account. So I think all of us had higher hopes for those tax cuts. The government said that they would play a part in boosting consumption. The fact that we've got retail numbers as the weakest they've been since the early 90s recession shows that they're not helping enough. So whether people save them or spend them, clearly whatever's in the system right now is insufficient to get the economy going again. And that's why Labor, the business community, the Reserve Bank, the IMF and others have been saying that the government needs a plan to boost the economy because whatever's happening right now is insufficient. We've got weak growth and weak wages, and something needs to be done to turn that around.
Well, you've said that you'd like to see the second phase of tax cuts brought forward. Would you also like to see an immediate lift to New Start And if so, can all of that be done as well as maintain a surplus?
Well, in the context of the surplus, Kieran, it's important to remember that the budget position has actually been strengthening even as the economy's been weakening. And that's because the surplus is built on the back of denying vulnerable Australians the support that they were promised and that they need and deserve, combined with higher than expected prices for our iron ore and other commodities and the low dollar, and the government can't take credit for those things. So there's plenty of room in the budget for the government to have a responsible and proportionate and measured stimulus which recognises that the economy is weaker than it should be. They should be able to do something to support workers and pensioners and New Start recipients in the budget without jeopardising that surplus.
So you believe you can do both, well, all three things: bring the tax cuts forward, increase New Start and maintain a surplus, that's doable?
Yes, Kieran, we've said we've given the government a menu of options. We said do some or all of these things, whether it be New Start, changes to their timing of their tax cuts, bring forward infrastructure investment, tax break for business investment, an energy policy, a wages policy. For some time now we've been making constructive contributions to that. So has the business community, so has the Reserve Bank, so have expert economists. Unfortunately, the government's just been sitting on their hands, and while they've dithered, the economy has deteriorated substantially on their watch.
The IMF has said ahead of its annual review that in case stimulus is needed, budget repair should be delayed, i.e. that the surplus should be shelved. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I read that IMF report. I think that they're right to say that the government needs a plan because growth's been weaker than expected, and there are still some risks on the horizon, so things, in their view, could get worse before they get better. But we think that that's possible to take action in a measured and proportionate and responsible way without jeopardising the surplus for all the reasons that I've just run through.
And finally, in terms of those other policies of which Labor took to the election on housing and retirees, how important is it to move on from those in terms of, you know, that economic bedrock that you talk about as being so pivotal to your political prospects? Surely you need a bit of clarity on some of that baggage.
Well, we're taking our time, Kieran, as you know, to work through all of the policies that we took to the last election. I think I've repeatedly made the pretty obvious point that no political party takes an absolutely identical set of policies to one election that they took to the last one. So we'll take our time to work our way through all of that. I've been doing a heap of consultation on all of those tax policies, not just the controversial ones. And what we'll do is we'll recognise that some of those challenges that we wanted addressed at the last election are still there. There may be better ways to address them. We'll come up with a coherent economic and budget policy for the next election, which recognises that we need to balance repairing the budget with growing the economy and doing all of the other things to meet our economic objectives.